Alright folks, this time around on Bart's list of reprehensible human beings, we've got someone by the colorful moniker of Thine Wandering Uterus, her handle being @only.bands. This adorable face right here. Here's another glowing picture of her charming ways from her TikTok page. Beautiful. I mean, this statement alone should already tell you the kind of depraved sexism and misandry that we're dealing with here, but we'll get to that. Miss Thine Wandering Uterus came into the same TikTok live stream as me recently and immediately interrupted me while I was in mid-speech, and when I protested with "please don't interrupt me," this stable specimen of humanity clapped back with a manic "don't interrupt me." I mean, that alone would be enough for most people to conclude that there are more than just a few screws loose in good old Miss Uterus's noggin. But no, her mania didn't stop there. She then went on an unhinged tangential rant about fragile masculinity and how it was a documented illness, which had next to nothing to do with me asking for specific examples from another person in the live about the so-called manosphere. Nor am I aware, and I suspect nobody else is either, of what source she's referencing when describing fragile masculinity as a documented illness, since I can't find any authoritative body designating it as a disorder or illness. More specifically, I was beginning to speak about how some women in the dating sphere today appear to want both gender equality and traditional male-female gender roles, two seemingly incompatible positions. This is what triggered Miss Thine Wandering Uterus into the stratosphere, propelling her to jump in the livestream and immediately start talking over me from her frantic script. She rounded off her tirade by proclaiming that fragile femininity did not exist because it did not result in people being unalived. Pumpkin, or rather Miss Thine Wandering Uterus, let me explain something to you since you clearly don't understand basic logic and reason, which is why you're unable to formulate a coherent argument. Since you're an anti-male sexist and/or misandrist, you might call this mansplaining. You are the walking, talking definition of fragile femininity, which is gender insecurities of women relative to men or other women, causing them to lash out with hostile confrontation, sexism, misandry, and/or delusional entitlement. That doesn't have to result in people being unalived for it to be a thing. You don't get to make up your own illogical standard or definition for something to deflect from confronting your mental illness. Do you think each instance of fragile masculinity results in someone being unalived? Do you think there are at least some instances of fragile femininity that have resulted in people being unalived? Physical confrontations are more likely amongst men, all else being equal, because men generally command greater physical strength than women, on average. The very terms fragile masculinity and fragile femininity are actually misnomers, since they imply that masculinity and femininity are innately problematic, as opposed to harmful or asocial behavior being explained by hyperaggression and/or internalized insecurities. Now, I'm sorry that you suffer from pathological gender insecurities, I really am, and that they cause you to fragilely fly off in an emotional rage whenever someone points out the incongruencies of modern society, or of your own worldview. But that doesn't excuse you acting like a free-range pig in a public forum, including interrupting me mid-speech and then ludicrously complaining that I was interrupting you. Nor does it validate your psychotic tangent about fragile masculinity, which, again, had next to nothing to do with my request for specific examples of the so-called manosphere, or my point about the incompatibility of some women's preferences in the dating world. And mind you, I was only speaking for perhaps 30 seconds before you jumped in and cut me off. Like, who the literal fuck do you think you are, sunshine? Interrupting me mid-sentence and then attempting to gaslight the audience into thinking I'm interrupting you? Fuck you. Had the roles been reversed, 100% you would have vomited up some neurotic derangement about mansplaining. As I've already mentioned, maybe take a giant step back,
take a big step back, and literally fuck your own face!
And stop spewing anti-male sexism for once in your miserable existence. You might actually learn something. I get that you need constant affirmation and validation to shore up your fragile femininity, but that doesn't remotely excuse your incivility, nor your anti-male sexism or misandry. Got that? For anyone else who runs into the specimen of fragile femininity, Miss Thine Wandering Uterus, @only.bands, don't tolerate her incivility or sexism. The moment she gets her untenable perspective triggered, she'll immediately counter with loony hostility and boilerplate scripts about fragile masculinity, just to deflect from having no argument on the merits. The hosts of the lives she's in are often friendly with her, and they'll mute your mic in her favor the moment she decides to interrupt you. That's what happened to me. Her buddy, Anthony G, @AnthonyG081, the host of the live we were in, automatically muted me in mid-speech, sanctioning not only her interruption, but her batty diatribe that followed, which, again, is nothing more than a projection of her own pathological gender insecurities. On what planet did you think that was okay, Anthony G? I mean, I realize you probably suffer from similar mental afflictions as your confederate, but it's not the responsibility of the TikTok community to subsidize those afflictions. Capiche? Oh, and for the record, not that it matters for the validity of what I'm saying here, I'm a diehard liberal feminist, which means I'm not going to stand for any sexism, whether anti-male or anti-female, or anti-intersex for that matter. Did you get all that, Miss Dine Wandering Uterus? Atta girl, a one-on-one debate between me and you, without your home field advantage of the host muting your opponents, would probably result in you going catatonic. Fortunately for you, I'm not on TikTok to do anyone any actual harm. I'm here to dispel misinformation and expose smug pseudo-intellectuals like you. Control yourself, and I highly recommend that you seek therapy for your fragility and anti-male sexism, okay? Here endeth your lesson, Miss Thine Wandering Uterus.
Here endeth the lesson.